N.U.S. Romy, the narrator's wife, and he had been planning their upcoming vacation for a long time. The stressful work that exhausted them both required a break. She divided her time between students as a teacher, and he dedicated his days to the art of sales. So, when they came across that Airbnb located on a small island off the coast of Florida, it seemed like the perfect solution. The photos left no doubt. A cozy two-room cottage right on the beach, with the palm trees reaching for the sky and endless ocean views. The price seemed incredibly attractive, only $150 a night, and that was for a whole week. It was significantly lower than all the other offers they had seen. The narrator recalls thinking, "This is too good to be true," but despite their doubts, they decided to book it. Looking back, they should have been wary of the reviews. Many of them mentioned the owner's tendency to charge extra fees, such as $200 for the slightest change in the position of a chair or dishes left in the sink. People called him strict, even picky, but the couple dismissed it as normal dissatisfaction and fussiness from vacationers. The anticipation of the vacation overshadowed all their concerns. 2 days before the scheduled departure date, the apartment owner, who introduced himself as Mr. Harron, wrote to the narrator in the Airbnb app, expressing a desire to call. It is worth noting that the narrator had stayed in dozens of different Airbnbs, and none of the owners had ever expressed such an intention. This seems strange, but the reluctance to cancel the booking at the last minute prevailed. Despite his dislike of phone calls, he agreed. The call followed immediately, and the conversation lasted a long 20 minutes. Mr. Papachetal. Harron asked about the narrator's work, the reasons for choosing this particular place for vacation, and even Romy's occupation. At first, this seemed like a manifestation of politeness, but soon the questions began to take on a personal tone, as if the owner needed to know all the details of their daily life. The narrator brushed aside these thoughts, deciding that Mr. Harron was simply being friendly. Following the phone conversation, a PDF file was sent containing the rules of residence, 27 pages long. It seemed like madness. The document contained items such as, "Do not touch the thermostat," "No guests," "Furniture must remain exactly in its place," and detailed instructions for cleaning each room. The owner insisted on confirming that the document had been read, and also demanded Romy's full name, phone number, and email address, explaining that this was necessary for emergency communication. The couple, having only skimmed the document, agreed, wanting to complete this procedure as soon as possible. On the day of arrival, they reached the island by ferry. The picture that appeared before their eyes was delightful: clear blue water, secluded beaches, and no crowds of tourists. The house matched the photos: white walls, a veranda surrounding the building, and just a few steps to the sandy shore. Inside, however, the atmosphere was outdated. Old floral sofas, 80s-style wood paneling, and creaky floors. But that didn't matter much, because they didn't come here for luxury. After unpacking, they headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. It was then that the narrator noticed the abundance of inscriptions. Literally everything was signed. The cabinets were emblazoned with stickers labeled plates, bowls, and cutlery. Even the shelves of the refrigerator had places indicated for milk and vegetables. It seemed that the labeling machine was the owner's best friend. Of course, everything was organized, but the narrator had a strange feeling that the house was prepared for inspection. not for living. From the very beginning, they had an uneasy feeling that someone was watching them. Romy shared this feeling. During conversations in the living room, the narrator would suddenly fall silent, thinking he heard a quiet click or hum. There were no obvious cameras in the house, no Ring doorbell or anything like that, but there was a modern Wi-Fi thermostat on the wall. It stood out against the rest of the old-fashioned decor, a rotary phone in the hall and an ancient TV with rabbit ears. Why a smart thermostat in such a place? The couple laughed about it and tried to enjoy their vacation. They swam, walked on the beach, and cooked food, but the feeling of being watched did not leave them. At night, lying in bed, the narrator looked at the ceiling and wondered if someone's eyes were watching them. On the third night, a storm broke out. Thunder shook the windows and the electricity went out for about 5 minutes. No big deal because this happens on the islands. When the electricity came back on, the Wi-Fi stopped working. The narrator rebooted the router, but before he could check his phone, Mr. Harland wrote to him on Airbnb, power outage. My maid said she had one too. I see the thermostat is off. Please connect to Wi-Fi as soon as possible. How did he know? He had to be on the mainland, several hours away. The maid lived nearby, but why would she call him about their electricity? And how did he see the thermostat? Romy and the narrator exchanged glances. Suddenly, it dawned on them. He must have remote access to the thermostat. But why was he so worried about the Wi-Fi? The narrator replied, "Everything is fine." But his head was spinning. He began to inspect the house more carefully. In the living room, he noticed a smoke detector that looked bigger than usual. Grabbing a chair, he climbed on it. And sure enough, there was a tiny lens, a hidden camera. The narrator's heart pounded. He checked the other sensors. The one in the kitchen was the same. In total, they found 4 cameras in the living room, in the kitchen, in the hallway, and one in the bedroom. Pointed at the bed. Romy panicked. "He's been watching us all this time," she hissed. They taped over the cameras, but it was too late. He had seen them unpacking, eating, and even changing clothes. They even changed clothes, trying to blend in with the surroundings. The night was almost sleepless. Any sound, whether it was the creaking of floorboards or the rustling of leaves outside the window, was perceived as someone's footsteps. The phone conversation with the landlord, his persistent inquiries about the details of their lives, and the ominous rules outlined in the PDF file kept playing in their heads. The clause about prohibiting interference with devices seemed particularly disturbing, the meaning of which was now frighteningly clear. Why did Mr. Harland need Romy's contact information? Had he been secretly watching them on the internet, collecting personal data? Anxiety turned into real paranoia. In the morning, gathering their courage, the author wrote to Mr. Harland about the hidden cameras. He brushed aside the accusations, stating that the cameras were installed solely for security purposes and were standard practice for rental housing. However, Airbnb's rules clearly state that hosts must notify guests of the presence of video surveillance. Mr. Harland did not do this. A heated argument began about whether to immediately leave this creepy place, but the ferry only ran twice a day, and the money for the stay had already been paid. Then events began to unfold according to an even stranger scenario. One afternoon, while Romy was resting, the author heard the noise of a car outside the window. Looking out, he saw a black SUV parked directly in front of the house. The engine was running. The car stood there for about half an hour, after which it suddenly drove away. Coincidence? Maybe. But intuition suggested that something was wrong. Soon after, Mr. Harlan sent a message. "Enjoying the beach? The weather is great today." How did he know about their walk on the beach? They hadn't posted any photos on social media. Romy checked her phone settings. The location tracking feature was turned off, and then it dawned on them. Wi-Fi. It was likely that spyware had been installed on the network. They immediately disconnected all their devices from Wi-Fi and switched to mobile internet. Towards the evening, overcome with anxiety, they began to pack their things to leave the ill-fated dwelling as soon as possible, while cleaning, trying to strictly follow Mr. Holland's rules. The author accidentally discovered a small notebook under the bed. It contained handwritten notes, such as, "Guests arrived at 3 p.m., unpacking in the bedroom," as well as detailed information about previous guests. The dates in the notebook matched the dates of the reviews that the author had read online. One of the entries read, "Couple argued loudly in the kitchen. Charge an extra cleaning fee." Mr. Harland was recording absolutely everything. Romy tried to contact Airbnb support, but the signal was very weak. The company's employees promised to investigate, but said that they would have to stay in the house for one more night. This last night turned into a real nightmare. They barricaded the doors with chairs, left the lights on. Around 2 a.m, the electricity suddenly went out, this time for a longer period. In the pitch darkness, the author heard scratching at the window. The wind or someone else. At that moment, the phone vibrated. A message came from Mr. Harland. "Wi-Fi is acting up again. The maid is already on her way to check." They froze in horror. Suddenly, headlights flashed outside the window. The same SUV had returned. "He's here," Romy whispered. They hid in the bathroom, their hearts pounding. The scratching stopped, and after 10 minutes, the car drove away. The electricity came back on, but they couldn't fall asleep that night. The long-awaited morning arrived, and they rushed to the ferry. Already on the way home, Mr. Harland left them a review. "Wonderful guests, followed all the rules, 5 stars." They immediately reported everything that had happened to Airbnb. In the end, Mr. Harland's listing was blocked, but the author still cautiously checks his accounts on the internet, fearing that he is still being watched. This cheap paradise turned out to be a real trap. If an offer seems too tempting, it's best to stay away from it. They learned this lesson from their own bitter experience. 2 years ago, on a rainy Thursday evening in Tacoma, Washington, the author was returning home from work. It was late, around 10:45 p.m. At that time, he didn't have a car, and the last bus only took him halfway, so he had to walk the remaining 15 minutes to his apartment. He was wearing a black hooded cloak and holding a small umbrella that barely protected him from the rain. His phone battery was almost dead, with only 12% remaining. The streets glistened with rain under the yellow glow of streetlights. It was quiet, except for the sound of cars passing in the distance, and the monotonous drumming of rain on his umbrella. At first, everything seemed normal. He passed the laundromat, where the lights were always on, even after closing. He passed the vape shop, which was already closed for the night. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. They didn't sound close, but they were clear and steady. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a man about half a block behind. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and jeans. The man wasn't looking at him, but he was moving in the same direction. The author tried to convince himself that nothing was wrong. People often walk the streets at night. However, the feeling of anxiety didn't leave him. He crossed the street at a faded crosswalk. The man followed him. The author slowed down near a diner that had closed an hour ago and pretended to check his shoelace. The man slowed down too. His heart began to beat faster. The author quickened his pace. The man's footsteps became faster and heavier. He gripped his umbrella tighter and stared straight ahead, trying not to make eye contact with his pursuer. Intuition told him that this was no longer a simple coincidence. He needed to find a safe place. The nearest lit building was a small convenience store a block away. He pushed open the glass door, and a bell rang in the silence. It was warm inside, and it smelled of coffee and old candy. The clerk in the baseball cap nodded to him in greeting. The author grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, even though he didn't need them, just to look like a regular customer. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that the man in the sweatshirt had stopped outside under the store's awning. He didn't come inside, but just stood there looking at the door. Quietly addressing the clerk, the author said, "I think someone was following me here." The clerk leaned over to look out the window, then looked back at the author. In a calm tone, he said, "You can wait here for a bit, if you want." The author paid for his purchases, his hands trembling slightly, and stood near the hot dog machine, pretending to check his phone. The battery showed 7%. Outside, the man continued to stand motionless under the awning. Suddenly, a white van pulled up to the curb behind him. It was an old cargo van with no side windows. The paint was dirty. There was a dent above the rear wheel, and the front passenger wheel was missing a hubcap. The man looked at the van, opened the passenger door, and got inside. The van idled for a moment, then slowly pulled away and drove down the street. Late in the evening, accompanied by a drizzling rain, I felt a sudden wave of nausea that forced me to seek refuge in the nearest store. Relief came, but the discomfort in my stomach persisted. After waiting a few minutes, I decided that the danger had passed, thanked the clerk, and plunged back into the embrace of the bad weather. Instead of quiet alleys, I chose the busy main road, walking quickly, with my keys clenched in my hand, as my mother had taught me. The street seemed deserted. Only the occasional headlights of cars broke the night silence. Reaching a bakery with a faded pink sign, I heard the sound of a slowly approaching engine behind me. Turning around, I saw the familiar white van, moving at the same speed as me. Behind the windshield, I could see the silhouette of a man. Without losing a second, I abruptly turned into the nearest alley, my shoes squelching in dirty puddles. The air was filled with the smell of wet garbage and motor oil. Dumpsters lined one wall, and old pallets leaned carelessly against fences. I ran, not feeling my feet, my umbrella helplessly hitting my shoulder. The van blocked the entrance to the alley, its headlights ominously illuminating the brickwork. I crouched behind a dumpster, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The van's engine was idling. For a moment, I thought I heard the sound of the sliding door opening, and then silence reigned. At the end of the alley, about half a block away, I noticed a police car parked under a traffic light. This sight filled me with an inexplicable hope. Jumping out from behind my shelter, I rushed towards the police car, waving my arms frantically. "Help!" I shouted at the top of my lungs. A female officer quickly got out of the car, raising her hand in a calming gesture. "What's going on?" she asked. Gasping for breath, I pointed towards the alley. The van, a white van. A man was following me. Then he got out of it and started following me again. "He's in there." The officer opened the back door and invited me to get in the car. She reported something on the radio and then stepped on the gas sharply. When we approached the alley, it was empty. My umbrella was floating alone in a puddle, but the van was nowhere to be seen. I was asked to describe what had happened in detail. I talked about the old white van with no side windows, with a dent above the rear wheel on the driver's side and a missing hubcap on the passenger wheel. The man was wearing a sweatshirt and had a short beard. Unfortunately, I didn't remember the license plate. The officer nodded and said, "You did the right thing by contacting me. Next time, don't wait. Call 911 right away." Turning on her flashing lights, she slowly drove down the street, carefully examining the side alleys, but the van seemed to have dissolved into thin air. I was overcome by an unpleasant feeling of realizing how quickly it had disappeared. The officer offered to drive me home. My apartment was about a mile away, and I gratefully accepted. I felt safe in the police car as the rain drummed on the windshield. I sat in the back seat, shivering all over, while the officer made notes in her notebook. She handed me a business card with her name and case number. "We'll be monitoring the situation tonight," she assured me. "Be safe." She waited until I went inside. I locked the door twice and collapsed on the floor without changing into dry clothes. My phone was dead, but I finally felt safe. The next morning in the daylight, I returned to the store hoping to find my umbrella, but it was gone. The clerk recognized me and asked worriedly, "Are you okay?" I assured him that everything was fine. He admitted that he had seen this van before, but didn't know who it belonged to. That same day, I bought pepper spray and have since tried to avoid late-night walks. The van was never found. Sometimes when it rains, I think I hear footsteps behind me, and in my imagination, the image of that old white van creeping along the sidewalk appears. This story happened last year when I decided to sell my old desk. It was an ordinary IKEA desk that had served me faithfully for many years. After purchasing a standing desk for work, I decided to get rid of the old one. I carefully measured it, took some photos, and posted an ad on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. In the ad, I clearly stated that the desk was on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator and would require 2 people to transport it. The same day, a man wrote to me. His profile had no photo, only a name. He asked if the ad was still valid and if I accepted cash. He didn't ask anything else. I replied in the affirmative but reminded him about the 3rd floor. In response, he sent only a thumbs up. I live in a small brick building with an intercom that works intermittently. Usually when someone arrives, they write to me and I go down to meet them. I plan to watch him from the window first before letting him in. As a precaution, I also alerted a friend about the meeting with the buyer. To avoid fumbling with the keys, I propped the door open with my boot. He arrived just after sunset in a silver sedan. The trunk was open, and inside lay a folded moving blanket, bungee cords, and a long rope. He got out of the car wearing a baseball cap and sweatshirt. He wasn't smiling, he was taciturn, only nodding quickly as if we had some kind of agreement besides the sale of furniture. "Third floor?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "It's not very heavy, but it's awkward. I'll need your help." He glanced at the front door. "No, thank you." "I'll just wait outside." I thought he was joking and chuckled. "I can't carry it out alone." He didn't answer, only carefully examined the building, as if counting the windows. I stood in confusion until he finally shrugged. "Okay." One day, when it was necessary to get rid of an old desk, it became necessary to resort to the services of a stranger found on an online platform. The negotiations were quick. The conditions were agreed upon, and soon a man appeared to pick up the piece of furniture. His words were laconic, limited to a simple "okay." Enos, as they started up the staircase, his shoes made a soft, insistent sound, dragging against the steps. On the second-floor landing, he unexpectedly asked, "Does anyone else live with you?" Driven by an inexplicable sense of caution, the narrator lied, mentioning a roommate who worked the night shift. Although he lived alone, the reluctance to reveal this fact was overwhelming. At the apartment door, the man paused, carefully observing everything: the room, the locks, even the security camera in the hall. He didn't cross the threshold until the narrator headed toward the table. "Nice place," he said. "Quiet building." Grasping opposite ends of the table, they began to carry it out of the bedroom. Halfway down the hall, the man casually dropped, "I'm sure you heard about the woman who was recently raped and murdered through Craigslist." The words were like a thunderclap. The narrator froze, feeling the heavy table dig into his side. "No," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah," the man said with a slight smile, "people are crazy." An overwhelming urge arose to drop the table and kick the uninvited guest out, but they were in the middle of the hallway, and the locked door could cut off escape. The narrator chose to remain silent, focusing on getting the table to the exit. They descended the stairs, the man guiding the load with only 2 fingers, never touching the railing. Darkness and silence reigned outside. Usually one of the neighbors spent evenings on the fire escape, enjoying a cigarette, but this time he was nowhere to be seen. A sedan with a running engine and an open trunk was parked at the curb. Rope and bungee cords were already prepared, as if everything had been carefully planned in advance. "Should fit," the man muttered. He took out a wad of cash, tied with a rubber band. The bills looked worn, as if they had passed through many hands. He slowly counted them, and handed over the entire sum, without trying to bargain or ask for a receipt. They slid the table into the trunk and secured it. The man tied it with rope, running it under the latch, then stepped back and looked up at the narrator's apartment windows. "You ever worry doing this?" he asked. "I'm careful," the narrator replied. "Good, you should be." With these words, the man got into the car and drove away, the ends of the rope flapping against the bumper as he disappeared around the corner. Back in the apartment, the narrator locked both doors, texted a friend that the deal was done, and sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had happened. The man's words seemed deliberate, as if he wanted them to be etched into memory forever. The narrator opened his laptop and began searching Craigslist for information about a murder that had occurred nearby. Nothing was found, only old cases from other states and recounted rumors, but no fresh news. It wasn't a warning, but rather a phrase dropped in the hallway immediately after asking if the narrator lived alone. He reviewed the security camera footage and noticed the moment when the man seemed to tilt his cap to hide his face. Perhaps it was just his imagination, but the clip was saved just in case. Around midnight, the intercom rang. One long ring. No words through the speaker. The narrator looked through the peephole for several minutes, but the hallway was empty. Then a text message arrived from an unknown number asking if the table was still for sale. The message included the man's name, as if he had forgotten he had already made the purchase. The narrator didn't respond. He blocked the number, deleted the ad, and filed a complaint through the app. That night he slept with a chair propped against the door. He woke up again and again to sounds he hadn't noticed before. The banging of pipes, footsteps in the hallway, the noise of cars on the next street. For weeks afterward, the narrator imagined seeing silver sedans. Every man in a baseball cap looked like that stranger. He carried his keys between his fingers when entering or leaving his home. He stopped posting anything that contained his address. If he ever had to sell something again, he would meet people in public places, preferably in the parking lot of a police station. He even bought a dolly so he wouldn't have to rely on strangers for help. Most of all, he was haunted by the phrase the man had uttered. It had nothing to do with buying furniture, but was said deliberately to evoke a sense of unease. He wanted the narrator to know what he was thinking about what could happen in an empty stairwell. He left with the table but tried to take away something more, a sense of security in his own home. If he could turn back time, the narrator would have closed the door the moment the man refused to help. He would have left the table or given it to a neighbor. Instead, he convinced himself it was almost over, that he just had to endure. The narrator shares this story now because it still haunts him. Nothing happened. No crime, no police report, no newspaper article. But the scariest moments are sometimes those that leave no physical evidence. Just a phrase, a rope in the trunk, and the memory of a man who wanted him to think about what could have happened. The story shifts to the fall of 2010 when the narrator moved to Cleveland, Ohio, to begin graduate studies at Cleveland State University. He rented a basement apartment on Euclid Avenue. A short walk across Chester and past the Rhodes Tower led to the department in just 10 minutes. The building smelled of dust, old carpet, and printer toner, creating a sense of comfort and stability. In October, the narrator was offered a part-time job in the department, which included duties related to phones, schedules, donor lists, and student recruitment. He immediately agreed, as tuition and rent left no room for pride. The chairman of the department was an elderly Jewish gentleman named Dr. Leonard Katz, whom everyone simply called Doc. He wore wool sweaters that shed, and he used a heavy metal ashtray that had once belonged to a diner. He smoked a pipe, packing it too tightly. The university had banned smoking in offices years ago, but Doc's room was in a quiet corner at the end of the hall next to the copy room. The smoky nook of his office was always dim. He preferred to keep the door slightly ajar, and a fan whirred tirelessly in the window, but even that couldn't dispel the thick veil of tobacco smoke. Conversation was his element. He happily shared memories of his parents living in Brooklyn, of the synagogue built by his grandfather, and persistently urged me to study Hebrew. He patiently explained all the nuances of my job, and then gradually involved me in his duties. Soon I was actively involved in organizing meetings with prospective staff. hosting alumni events and preparing presentations for major donors. Money flowed like water, and they preferred to turn a blind eye to the thick tobacco smoke. Before entering graduate school, I had taken a course to become an EMT, and he asked me to take his blood pressure several times a week. He suffered from gout, high blood pressure, and his heart seemed to be working at its limit, although he didn't admit his fatigue. I carefully recorded the data on small sticky notes and hid them under his massive brass paperweight. Every Monday, I brought him a jar of homemade soup made by my grandmother. He carefully unscrewed the lid, inhaled the fragrant steam, and closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring the moment. As winter approached, this ritual seemed immutable. I came to work early, usually with the first rays of sunlight. I turned on the bright fluorescent lights, made coffee, and quietly answered emails. Doc would appear in the middle of the morning, with folders under his arm, his ever-present pipe in his pocket, and his ashtray clanging as he walked. He would automatically knock the ash out of his pipe, even when it was completely empty. One evening, late in the winter, the phone rang at my house. Doc reported that he had been unable to urinate for more than a day. His voice was even and restrained. I promised to call his son in Shaker Heights and then call an ambulance. A team of medics from university hospitals transported him to the Cleveland Medical Center. Later, a nurse said that another day of delay could have been fatal for him. They successfully removed the blockage, and the relief on his face was so obvious that he seemed not to know where to look out of embarrassment. He was transferred to a rehabilitation center in Manura Park in Beechwood. It was clean, quiet, and full of light. I visited him every few days, bringing work documents with me to keep him up to date. He carefully studied the lists, made short notes in the margins, and gave instructions on which alumni to interview and how best to do it. He confessed that he missed the echoing sounds of our hallway. At the end of February, a colleague called him in the morning to ask how he was feeling. A paramedic answered. They suspected a stroke and asked us to contact the family. He died the same day at the Cleveland Clinic. The funeral was held a few days later in a small chapel on Taylor Road in Cleveland Heights. Snow slush squished underfoot in the parking lot. His son thanked me for the soup, but I couldn't find the words to respond. The first week in the office without him felt wrong, as if something was broken. His computer and phone were neatly packed in boxes and labeled with blue tape, and the metal ashtray remained in the middle of his desk, as if no one dared touch it. The smell in the hallway gradually faded, turning into a barely perceptible, sweetish tinge. About a week after the funeral, I came to work before anyone else. It was still dark outside, and the building's night heating system was running. I opened the office, turned on the lights, and put my bag on the desk. Suddenly, the phone rang. No one usually called at this hour. I picked up the phone and greeted it without my usual preamble. In response, I heard only static electricity, not a voice, not silence, but a soft, steady hiss that occurs when a radio is not tuned to a station. Then there was the sound of metal on metal. I jumped up, and my chair rolled back to the filing cabinet. It was the exact sound of Doc knocking his pipe into that very ashtray, no doubt about it. I had heard it 1,000 times. Then followed a long sigh of static electricity, as if someone was standing close to the microphone and hesitant to speak. After that, the connection was lost. I looked at the caller ID. The screen read internal, and 4 digits that had been Doc's extension since my first day of work. The same number was printed in the old phone book taped to the inside of the pantry door. I knew it by heart. I headed down the empty hallway to his office. The light above the door was not on. The lock had not yet been changed, so I used my key and went inside. The ashtray was still in the center of his desk. In it lay 2 small pieces of ash. The telephone was missing. It had been packed in a box and placed on a metal shelf in the copy room. The line had been disconnected a week ago. I took out the key and tried to convince myself that it was all in my imagination. The number and the sound. I repeated these words to myself over and over until people started arriving, and the usual office noise drowned out all my thoughts. Late in the morning, Officer James O'Malley from Campus Security entered my office. His face was unnaturally pale. He asked if everything was okay on our floor. I automatically replied, yes. He shook his head and looked down the hall. He said that he was making his rounds just after sunrise and saw Doc walk past the copy room and into his office. He was wearing the same sweater, and he walked with the same cautious gait. The door closed, but the light never came on. O'Malley stood there hesitantly, not knowing whether to knock. In the end, he decided not to. When he returned a few minutes later, the hallway was empty. He wrote the time in his notebook and moved on, not knowing what else he could do. I didn't tell him about the phone call. He didn't ask anything else. He left, and the doorway seemed too bright for a moment. Memories of bygone times sometimes arise quite unexpectedly. One day, the sunlight seemed too bright, as if reminding me of something long forgotten. One day, towards evening, the faint aroma of tobacco returned to the air. Not strong, not everywhere, but only in a small section of the carpet near the office door. This specific, slightly sweet smell seemed to settle on the tongue. The author spent more time there than he should have, inhaling the air and staring at the closed door with the sign that was soon to be replaced. A semester passed, followed by another. The following year, the author graduated and began working on the other side of town. Sometimes there were reasons to return to campus. The 4th floor hallway looked more dilapidated each time. A new chair appeared in the professor's former office. The ashtray disappeared into the archives. In the fall of 2018, the author had the opportunity to give a presentation. Arriving early, he decided to walk through the building as usual. The 4th floor was cool and dim. A glass nameplate sat on the new chair, replacing the old paper one. Entering the copy room to print materials, the author noticed a familiar cardboard box on the top shelf. The flaps were folded, tied with blue tape, with a label written in black marker. The professor's name was neatly written on it. Lifting the flap, the author found an old pipe and a coiled cord. A yellow disconnect tag was attached to them, indicating the month and year. Lowering the flap, he paused, his hand on the box, and listened. From the hallway came the distinct sound of metal on metal. It was coming from the direction of the professor's former office. Not loud, not ominous, but just mundane and out of place in a building where no one had smoked for a long time. Stepping into the hallway, the author looked around. The hallway was empty. Inhaling the air, he caught a faint hint of sweet, stale tobacco that could not have belonged to any of the current staff. Before leaving, the author visited the telecommunications department to inquire about old internal calls, as if he needed some practical detail to feel more at ease. He was informed that the professor's line had been physically disconnected in early March of that year. No forwarding, no workarounds, no internal call could have been made after that date. Thanking the employee, the author headed towards the elevator, watching the floor numbers rise and fall as someone else pressed a button. Now, when visiting the building, he tries not to linger in that corner. Sometimes a hallway is just a hallway, but sometimes it's something more. One fine October day in 2019, the author, his wife Sophia, and their 6-year-old son Tommy decided to visit the VA pumpkin farm located near Gretna, Nebraska. They had heard about it from friends. It was one of the largest places for fall entertainment in the state. Hayrack rides, pumpkin picking, and a huge corn maze spanning about 10 acres. Living in Omaha, they reached the farm in just half an hour. Tommy was thrilled, bouncing in his car seat and talking about wanting to get lost in the maze, like in the cartoons. Sophia and the author just smiled, thinking it would be a great family outing before the cold weather set in. Arriving at the site around noon, they found the farm full of people. Families were everywhere. Children with caramel apples and the aroma of cider donuts filled the air. First, they did the usual things, picking pumpkins, riding the hayrack, and feeding the goats in the petting zoo. Tommy was thrilled with everything. Then they headed to the corn maze. A sign indicated that it was suitable for the whole family, but it could take up to an hour to complete. At the entrance, they were given a map, but Tommy began to ask to play hide and seek. "Dad, let me hide and you find me," he said with a wide smile. Sophia rolled her eyes but agreed, adding that they should stick together. The maze turned out to be taller than they expected. The cornstalks towered more than 7 feet, dry and rustling in the wind. The paths meandered in all directions, forming dead ends and cul-de-sacs. They started playing. Tommy ran ahead, giggling, and hid behind a wall of corn. He was found quickly the first few times, but then he ran further, shouting, "You can't catch me." Sophia and the author split up a bit to cover more ground, calling out his name. At first it was fun, but after 10 minutes there was no sign of him. "Tommy, this isn't funny anymore," the author shouted. Sophia's voice sounded alarmed. "Honey, come out." They continued searching, but the maze was confusing. Every turn seemed the same. The sun hadn't set yet, so they weren't panicking yet. They met other families who said they hadn't seen a child alone. By 4:00 p.m., employees announced over the loudspeakers that the maze would be closing soon. They told the worker at the exit about Tommy's disappearance. He contacted others by radio, but to no avail. "Kids hide all the time," one of the workers said. "He'll be found." But as the crowd thinned, the author was overcome with dread. Sophia was already crying. They took flashlights from the car and returned to the maze despite its closure. Night fell quickly. By 6:00 p.m., it was completely dark. There was no moon, only stars. The wind made the corn whisper, like a quiet voice. They shouted Tommy's name again and again. "Tommy, where are you?" The echoes reverberated around, but there was no answer. Their phones had intermittent signal, the rural Nebraska countryside making its presence felt. Still, they called 911. The dispatcher said she would send officers to the scene, but it would take about 20 minutes. "Stay where you are," she said, but they couldn't. They ventured deeper into the maze, the light from their flashlights cutting through the darkness. After about an hour, Sophia noticed something in the mud by the trail. Tommy's little red sneaker was stuck in the mud, as if he had tripped. The author felt a chill inside. "Oh no," Sophia whispered. Small footprints led away, and then larger footprints from adult shoes joined them. At that moment, anxiety reached its peak when a faint whistle reached their ears, as if someone was calling a dog. The sound came from very close by, and then there was a rustling in the thick corn stalks. "Who's there?" the man shouted, pointing his flashlight into the darkness. Silence was the only response. Hearts pounded as they followed the tracks left by the unknown person. The maze now seemed endless, as if its walls were constantly changing position. Sophia gripped her companion's arm tightly. "What if someone took him?" she whispered. The man tried not to think about it, but there were always vagrants in Nebraska. Homeless people traveling on freight trains and living in the fields during harvest. Farms here are isolated, and disappearances are, unfortunately, not uncommon. And soon they came upon a small clearing, like a secret, well-trodden place. Trash was scattered around, empty cans, a dirty sleeping bag, and cigarette butts. Clearly, someone had been living there, right in the heart of the maze. A cold feeling of foreboding settled over them. Suddenly, a raspy male voice emerged from the shadows. "Looking for the boy." They froze. A tall, ragged figure in a worn coat appeared from the gloom. The stranger's face was hidden in shadow, but the man could make out wild eyes and an unkempt beard. "He's safe," the stranger said with a smirk. "But you'll have to play my game." As it turned out, he was a drifter named Earl, who had been wandering the Midwest for years, hiding from the police for petty theft and other more serious crimes. He had been hiding in the cornfields around Wallace, preying on unsuspecting passers-by. He would lure children with candy or toys, using the maze's confusing paths to abduct them while their parents were distracted. Ransom was his preferred tactic. He would demand money from desperate families, or sometimes just disappear with the children. It later came to light that he had pulled similar stunts in Iowa, but no one could connect all the episodes. "Give him back!" Sophia screamed. Only laughter echoed in response. "Follow me if you can," the Shabbater drifter said. "But one wrong turn, and he's gone forever." With those words, he darted into the corn. They rushed after him, but the stranger knew the maze like the back of his hand. He had created secret trails, shortcuts through the dense thickets. Suddenly, Tommy's voice could be heard. "Mommy!" it echoed, but it was just a trick. The drifter was skillfully imitating a child's voice. A glimpse of his coat flashed in the flashlight beam, and then all was silent. Sophia stumbled and fell into the mud, unable to hold back her tears. The man helped her up, but they themselves were lost. The drifter was playing with them, it seemed, for an eternity. "Here!" came a whisper from the darkness. Soon they found another of Tommy's shoes, smeared with mud. Terrible thoughts raced through the man's mind, painting pictures of what the kidnapper might do. Ransom notes left in abandoned barns and stories of children who were never found flashed through his memory. Real cases of abductions in rural areas he had read about came to mind one after another. Children snatched right from farms, their bodies found in ditches. The Nebraska plains seemed to hold many dark secrets. Finally, they heard Tommy's real cry, "Daddy!" Bursting through a wall of corn, they found themselves in another clearing. There, tied to a post and gagged, sat Tommy. His eyes were wide with terror. At that moment, the drifter lunged at the man with a knife. rusty and dirty. He managed to knock him off balance. Years of working on the farm in his youth came in handy. They rolled around in the mud, fighting for their lives. The drifter slashed the man's arm, and blood sprayed everywhere. Sophia, without hesitation, grabbed a rock and struck the kidnapper's arm. He howled in pain and dropped the knife. The man pinned him to the ground, desperately yelling for help. After a few minutes, police officers arrived. Bright flashlight beams illuminated the cornfield. Dogs barked. They put the drifter in handcuffs and freed Tommy. The boy was okay, just scared and cold. As it turned out, the drifter had been watching them all day, waiting for Tommy to get lost. He had planned to demand $5,000 in ransom and hide in an abandoned silo nearby. That night, they drove home. Tommy was asleep in the back seat of the car. Sophia and her husband hardly spoke. Local authorities closed the maze for a week, but the man still has nightmares and wakes up in a cold sweat, hearing that eerie whistle in the wind. Corn mazes, never again. In December 2007, one family's life changed forever. Leah Hickman, the narrator's cousin, was only 21 years old. She was a bright and kind young woman who was just starting to build her future. Leah worked at a hair salon in Huntington, West Virginia, and lived in a small apartment building near the Marshall University campus. The narrator remembers their last meeting shortly before Christmas. Leah was looking forward to the holidays and talking about how she couldn't wait to take a break from work. She was always smiling and making plans for the future. None of them could have imagined what was about to happen. On the night of December 14th, Leah finished her shift at the salon and returned to her third-floor apartment in the small brick building. From the outside, the building looked unremarkable, just an ordinary place for students and young professionals to live. But there was always a strange feeling inside. The hallways were narrow, the lighting dim, and an eerie silence filled the building at night. Leah shared the apartment with her stepsister, but she was alone that night. Earlier in the evening, she had called a few friends, but after that, no one heard from her. The next day, when Leah didn't show up for work, her colleagues grew concerned. She was responsible and never missed work without warning. Calls began. First, the salon called her, but no one answered. Then her sister tried to reach her, but again, to no avail. By evening, their mother was starting to panic. Leah always called back, and her silence was completely uncharacteristic. It was completely out of character for her. The author, along with others, went to her apartment. He will never forget the feelings that overcame him as he climbed the steps, hoping to find her at home, embarrassed by the commotion. But those hopes were dashed. The door was locked. Her car was still in the parking lot. Inside the apartment were her purse and shoes, but Leah herself was nowhere to be found. It was the most disturbing sight he had ever seen. Her belongings were in their places, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. There were no signs of a struggle, no disarray. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The police immediately began their investigation. They thoroughly searched the area, knocked on neighbors' doors, and questioned all the residents of the building. Some neighbors claimed to have heard footsteps late at night, but no one could say for sure. The most ominous circumstance was the presence of a basement in the building, where old storage rooms were located. Police meticulously searched it, but at first found nothing. There was a depressing atmosphere, darkness, dampness, and eerie silence. The fruitless search continued for several days. Flyers with her picture appeared all over Huntington. The family stayed glued to their phones, desperately hoping to hear any news. Every night, the author tried to fall asleep, but thoughts of where she might be haunted him. He imagined her perhaps feeling afraid and wondered if she was still alive. On December 19th, 5 days after her disappearance, police returned to the ill-fated basement. It was there that they found her. Leah's body was hidden in a small crawl space under the stairs. Even now, as the author writes these lines, he feels nauseous. The realization that she had been so close all along, while everyone was frantically searching for her, tormented his soul. This tragic event became the top news story in West Virginia. Everyone was eager to know who could commit such an atrocity against a sweet, hard-working young woman who seemed to have no enemies. Police questioned all her acquaintances, colleagues, and even neighbors. Rumors spread throughout the city, with people claiming to have seen or heard something, but none of these leads yielded concrete results. To this day, Leah's killer has not been found. The case remains unsolved, casting a shadow over the lives of her loved ones. What makes the situation particularly bitter is how ordinary the evening before the tragedy was. Leah went to work as usual and came home. Perhaps she was making plans for Christmas, watching television, or getting ready for bed, and then, at some point, an intruder entered her life and cut it short. No alarm, no loud noises that might have alerted those around her, just an ominous silence. For the author, the hardest thing to bear was the realization of how lonely she must have felt in the last moments of her life. An apartment is supposed to be a haven of safety, especially when it is your home. But for Leah, it turned into a place where she was deprived of her life. Sometimes the author drives past that same building in Huntington, and it still sends shivers down his spine. From the outside, it looks perfectly ordinary. Students and young people come and go, unaware of the tragedy that occurred there. I wonder if they know Leah's story, or if it's just another old building near the university campus for them. The family cherishes her memory, but the realization that justice has not been served causes unbearable pain. They still don't know who took her from them and why, and it haunts them. The perpetrator, whoever he is, may still be at large. Someone who dared to kidnap a young woman from her apartment, hide her, body just a few steps away from her, and then disappear without a trace, as if nothing had happened. Every time the author thinks about it, he feels the same chilling sensation. It could happen to anyone. Leah was only 21 years old. She had her whole future ahead of her. And on one unremarkable December night, she disappeared from their lives forever. Next, a person named Hugh recounts his experience as a police sergeant in the New York City Police Department in the Bronx. This job was not his dream, but became a backup option after he failed to make it as an actor. During his work, the shifts were not always challenging. Sometimes he had to deal with calls involving people in crisis, but until a certain point, he didn't have to experience such a difficult experience that he is about to tell. One evening in October 2016, around 6:00 p.m., a call came into 911 about a woman who was supposedly acting erratically in her apartment building on Pugsley Avenue in Castle Hill. Neighbors had complained about her before, and Hugh was one of the officers sent to investigate. Arriving on the scene, he learned from the dispatcher that the situation may involve someone with emotional disorders. An EMT was already there, trying to calm the woman in her living room. The woman had put down the scissors she was holding and seemed to have calmed down a bit. At that moment, she did not pose an immediate threat, and the EMT was explaining the reason for their visit. Hugh, wasting no time on talking, quickly assessed the situation and decided to approach, hoping to defuse the situation. The woman, who looked to be around 60 years old, retreated into her bedroom as they approached. At that moment, Hugh's professional instincts kicked in. By instinct, he followed her into the room, followed by the other officers, trying to convince the woman that she was safe and assuring her that they were only there to help. He tried to calm her down, urging her to stay calm. At first, she was clutching scissors in her hands, but his persuasion worked, and she put them down on the bed. In that brief moment, there was a glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution, but the situation suddenly escalated to the extreme. He took a step forward, intending to carefully grab her to prevent her from trying to grab the scissors again. He felt he was close enough to safely subdue her if necessary. Police protocol dictates that in such circumstances, one should act slowly, waiting for backup or using non-lethal means. However, he decided that he could handle the situation immediately, but she was quicker. Dodging him, she swiftly pulled a baseball bat from under the pillow. Jumping to her feet, she gripped the bat in her hands, like a batter ready to swing, and moved towards him. His heart pounded in his chest. He drew his gun and, retreating, ordered her to drop the bat. "Please drop it. I don't want to hurt you," he repeated, over and over. The other officers froze in the doorway, but he was closest, alone with her in the room. She remained deaf to his pleas. Raising the bat over her head, she swung at him. He saw it coming right at him. That blow could shatter his skull and kill him instantly. He had no choice. He fired twice, hitting her in the torso. She collapsed to the floor, the bat falling from her hands. At first, she still showed signs of life, making moaning sounds, but then she fell silent. He continued to hold his gun at the ready, ordering her not to move, but she was no longer responding. With trembling hands, he radioed for medical assistance. The arriving EMT immediately began performing CPR while waiting for other paramedics to arrive. When backup and the ambulance arrived, they took over, but it was too late. The woman was pronounced dead at the hospital. Her name was Deborah Danner. She was 66 years old. She had suffered from schizophrenia for decades, and as it later turned out, she had suffered a severe episode. She was not using drugs, but her mental illness made her unpredictable, and she wrote essays about how hard it was to live with it, like a curse that should not have been fatal. In the first minutes after the tragedy, he was broken. He didn't sob, but he felt a wave of regret wash over him. Why did she have to swing that bat? He muttered to himself and the other officers. I'm not a violent person. I've been on dozens of similar calls and never fired a shot. But in that split second, it was her or me. I had to protect myself to stay alive. He replayed the incident over and over in his head. Should he have waited for the crisis response team? Should he have used a taser? Department protocols regarding the mentally ill emphasize the need for de-escalation and waiting for specialists. But everything happened too quickly. The aftermath turned into a nightmare. In less than 6 hours, He was suspended from work, stripped of his badge and gun. The mayor publicly stated that he had violated protocols, and if he had followed them, the woman might still be alive. Protests erupted the next day. People marched from her house to the police station, chanting slogans about Black Lives Matter and police brutality. Since she was African American, and he was the white officer who shot her, it became a reason to escalate the conflict. Several months later, he was arrested, charged with second-degree murder. The trial was grueling. He had to testify about every detail of what happened. He presented his point of view. He entered the bedroom to grab her before she could rearm herself, but she was quicker. When she swung the bat, his whole life flashed before his eyes. In 2018, the judge acquitted him on all charges, ruling that it was justified self-defense. But even after that, the guilt does not let him go. At times, he doubts himself, wondering if another approach could have saved her life. An officer from his team, Edward, helped perform CPR on her for what seemed like an eternity. About 10 minutes until the paramedics took her away. Everyone hoped for her recovery, but a miracle did not happen. He still works in the police, returning to his duties after the trial. Fortunately, nothing like this has happened since. But that night left an indelible mark on his soul. It was a tragic story that no police officer would want to experience. It reminds him every day how fragile such encounters are, especially when it comes to mental illness. More sophisticated training methods and more resources are needed, because no one should die this way, and no officer should make such decisions. In 2013, he traveled to San Juan, Puerto Rico, for his brother's wedding. The warm ocean air and the joyful excitement of a family gathering made the whole trip a fairy tale. He was 18 years old, just entering adulthood, and shared a hotel room with his older sister and her boyfriend. Everything was supposed to be perfect, but something was wrong. However, behind the external prosperity, something disturbing was hidden. The first signs of impending trouble were subtle. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, when a peaceful silence reigned in the room, the sister was engrossed in reading, and her companion was scrolling through the news feed on his phone. The phone rang. Picking up the phone, I heard a male voice, devoid of warmth, with hoarse notes. "This is from reception," the stranger said monotonously, but his intonation felt threatening, making me freeze. "You must be quiet. You are too noisy." But we were not making any noise. No loud music, no TV, just a leisurely conversation. The thought flashed through my head that this might be a prank by my father, known for his pranks. "Is this serious?" I asked, not knowing how to react. "Absolutely serious," the man growled and hung up. Calling my father back, I made sure that it was not him, and his voice sounded genuinely alarmed. Exchanging worried glances with my sister and her boyfriend, we decided not to attach any importance to this and went to the jacuzzi, where the wedding celebration was taking place, trying to dispel the gloomy thoughts. But an unpleasant aftertaste remained, like a corrosive smell that cannot be identified, but you feel that it does not belong here. Late at night, returning to the room, we felt a change in the atmosphere. It was already after midnight, and the usual evening rituals did not bring comfort. Suddenly, the phone rang again, the same voice, the same hostility. "Do you think it's funny?" he hissed, "running around the corridors like wild animals? It must stop." In a trembling voice, I tried to object. "We were not even there." In response, there were only short beeps. Without wasting time, I contacted reception. This time a woman answered. Her voice sounded calm and professional. "No, ma'am," she assured. "No hotel employees have called your room." After listening to my story, she expressed concern and promised to investigate the situation. 15 minutes later, a hotel employee in an impeccable suit knocked on our door. His tired look spoke of sleepless nights. "We believe that the calls are coming from a guest residing at the end of the corridor," he said in a hushed voice. "He has already caused us problems. He will be evicted tomorrow. We apologize for the inconvenience. Please avoid contact with him if he tries to contact you again." We nodded in agreement, but as soon as the door closed, the phone rang for the third time. This time, my sister's boyfriend answered the phone. "There is a man in this room," he shouted into the phone, trying to speak confidently. The caller immediately hung up, but the anxiety did not recede. We disconnected the phone. Unfortunately, the troubles did not end there. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by a quiet scraping. Sitting up in bed, I noticed that the others were sleeping. Holding my breath, I tried to determine the source of the sound. It repeated. Something was scratching the door. Quietly getting out of bed, I approached the door. At the bottom, I saw a barely noticeable shadow. Someone was standing right behind the door. I did not dare to open it. Freezing in place, I waited for the shadow to disappear. In the morning, waking up feeling broken and tired, we found a note under the door. It was written in shaky male handwriting on a hotel letterhead. "You ruined my night. I hope you understand what it's like now. I heard your every word, every step. I don't forgive those who deprive me of sleep." There was no signature, only the absence of a room number. I was gripped by a chilling horror. We were not noisy. We did not attract attention. He was eavesdropping. He was waiting. Enos. What frightened me most wasn't the phone calls, but the thought that we were being watched, that our every move was being monitored. He knew when we got back, when we went to sleep. He stood outside our door while we slept. The hotel staff responded promptly. They confirmed that the suspicious guest had been evicted that same day. Security reviewed the hallway surveillance footage, but didn't share what they saw with us. We never learned the man's name. For the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My sleep was fitful, and every creak in the walls made me jump. I constantly checked the peephole. I avoided elevators. What terrified me most was how easily he had invaded our lives while remaining unseen. And even now, when the phone rings in the middle of the night, my heart skips a beat, because I can never forget that voice